Welcome to another episode of The Artsy Raven, a show about writing and publishing with your host, J.F. Garrard.
Welcome to the Artsy Raven. Today, our special guest is Hilary Davidson. So, Hilary was a journalist before she turned to the dark side and started writing crime fiction. Her novels include the award winning Lily Moore series, the best selling Shadows of New York series, and the standalone novels Blood Always Tell and Her Last Breath. She is also the author of some 50 short stories, and her fiction has won quite a few awards. And her novels have been translated into French, German, Hungarian, Polish, Romanian, and Russian. Toronto born and raised, she moved to New York City in October 2001. She is also the author of 18 nonfiction books. So, welcome, Hilary.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here.
Can you tell us a little bit about your background before you started writing?
Sure, yeah. So actually, before I started writing novels, I was a travel journalist for years, for about a decade. And it was really funny. I kind of got into it in a strange way. I'm from Toronto originally, and I started pitching Toronto to magazines and newspapers, basically as a place to write about. I kept feeling like people were saying, oh, well, I've heard good things about Toronto, but I've never been there. And so instead of going to other, sort of exotic places, I pitched my hometown and ended up getting into travel writing that way. And it led me to writing 17 different Frommer's guides. 10 of those were about Toronto, because year after year I would do the
Yeah.
Toronto guide. But I eventually got to travel all over the world, sort of from that springboard, and became the honeymoon columnist for Martha Stewart Weddings and
Oh,
actually doing a lot of honeymoon travel. It was really funny because everyone sort of thinks of that as like a happy sort of area, and it is. But I always had these crime stories in my mind as I traveled as well. So finally, I sort of managed to merge the two in my crime fiction. But yeah, I started with a travel background.
oh. So yes, I was gonna ask, like, what sort of drew you to like crime writing from travel writing? Like, it's quite different.
Right, exactly. Like you think like those two things, what do they have in common? So I would say for me personally, I think one of the interesting sort of intersections between travel writing and crime writing is that people are in a way more vulnerable when they're traveling, when you're in an unfamiliar area, if you don't know the language, if you're jet lagged, if you're dehydrated, just, there are all sorts of reasons why people are sort of not their usual selves when they travel. And also, though, sometimes people kind of want to do things when they travel that they wouldn't do at home. There are risks that they would take
Yeah.
when they travel that sort of outside their usual personality. And so I feel like with sort of often using international settings in my books and my stories, that I've sort of managed to take advantage, of that and do the two things. The truth is, for me, crime fiction would be my first love, and I say that because as a young child, I was reading Nancy Drew books and I was
Mm.
obsessed with them, read the whole series. And then when I was done with that, moved on to Agatha Christie and then moved on like to Robert B. Parker and Sarah Paretsky. And just, I always loved the genre. I just, we couldn't really get enough of it. And I was sort of fascinated by the ways that, these writers would play with my mind as I was reading. And so it's really funny that, I never thought of that though as a real job. And so it's really funny that I sort of came around to that as an adult after working in journalism for years. It's like, actually, no, I can make a career out of writing these crazy characters.
Has moving to New York influenced the way you like? Did you start writing while in Toronto and then move to New York, or did you start
So
writing in New York?
I was already like a full-time freelance journalist when I was living in Toronto. Um, I quit my job in 1998 to write full-time. And it was about a year after that that I started working for Frommer's. So I was doing the travel writing, gigs that started but like years before I moved to New York. Um, and it's funny, I'm not sure how much moving to New York influenced my writing, I would say that in both Toronto, my hometown, and New York, my adopted hometown, that I'm surrounded by a lot of writers. So I certainly, in both places, there are writing groups that I belong to and a lot of writers that I hang out with. So I would say both places are probably really encouraging places to be, both as a freelancer and as a fiction writer. Um, but certainly, I moved right after 9/11. Like, I literally moved in
Okay.
October 2001. And that was just because my green card happened to come
Mhm.
through like basically a month, or not even a month before 9/11. It came through about 2.5 weeks before 9/11. And so definitely it was living through a really dark time in New York. Below 14th Street, everything was shut down. There was, a no-go zone to traffic. And my husband had worked in the World Trade Center, so there was also, he lost coworkers in that.
Yeah.
So there was definitely a very personal connection. So, probably on some, subconscious level, there's probably something there that made me think about darker possibilities. But yeah, it's sort of hard to quantify. I feel like I probably would have turned to crime if I had stayed in Toronto as well. I think that
Yeah.
probably that transition would have occurred wherever I was living.
Okay. Now you also write short stories. Like writing short stories, nonfiction and fiction. Like, how do you have an idea and then decide, what is what?
So for me, the starting point is always character. And one thing I would say, the sort of the divide between my short stories and my novels over the years has been that with short stories, I've been willing to go to much darker places and write about characters with terrible motivations, characters who they have their own justifications for what they're doing, but they're not necessarily good people. Some of them are very bad people. And in my novels, it's usually a much more a character who's motivated by justice, a character who has close family relationships and they really care passionately about the case, and that's how they got involved. And I will say, in my new book, Every Lie I Told, those two worlds finally intersect. My main character is a terrible person. She's a professional liar. She lies to everyone in her life, in her business life, in her personal life. And she's very careerist and sort of will throw anyone under the bus if it helps her. So it's funny because I've usually had those two sort of worlds separate, and they are starting to merge a bit now. But short stories are my playground, and that's actually where I started. When I started writing fiction, it was with short stories. And I think partially that's because I love the genre. I'm sort of a long time, short story aficionado. And so I can think of just, stories that have influenced me, ones that I really loved. And I think maybe it felt a little bit easier to break in that way. Um, that instead of committing to writing 80,000 words and who knows, how long that would take me and who knows if that would go anywhere, to sort of do these experiments. I would hear the voice of a character in my head, and I would just sort of start making notes and start following that character, just kind of keep them in my head when I was doing other things. And, that's really just, where a lot of the short stories came from, is sort of hearing a character's voice, having a character that kind of wants to tell me a story. I don't know where they come from. I feel often that I'm channeling something as I write because I can't always explain. Sometimes I can point to a news story where something came from, or a conversation I overheard, because I am a big eavesdropper. But not always. Sometimes there are characters that just I cannot tell you where this voice came from, but I heard it and I had to write it down.
Cool. Now let's talk a little bit about your latest book, The Every Lie I Told You. Could you give us a little bit of a synopsis and then tell
Sure,
us what
yeah.
inspired it?
So
Yeah.
so I mentioned already the main character is not a good person. Her name is Jackie Swift, and she is a public relations executive whose focus is on criminals. She basically rehabilitates the reputations of criminals and sort of tries to cast aspersions on their accusers. I mean, she is someone who's, a fixer, basically. And as the book begins, though, she gets a call from her sister in the middle of the night telling her that her sister's at a party and that she's overdosed on an opioid. And she asks Jackie to come over and bring her the antidote. And Jackie does rush over because her sister is the one person in the world that she genuinely loves and cares about. But when she gets to the house, there's no party. Her sister isn't there. Instead, there's a man's dead body. And it's a man that Jackie knows. It's someone she used to work for, someone whose crimes that she's covered up. And Jackie knows enough about her sister to know that her sister cares passionately about justice. She believes that her sister must have gone to this man's house deliberately to kill him. And Jackie figures, well, what my sister must want is for me to cover this up, to, call the police and sort of throw sand in the wheels so that, my sister doesn't get caught. But as the story unfolds and her sister stays missing and Jackie can't find her, even though she's trying to protect her sister from being a suspect in this case, she starts to realize that, her sister may actually be in a lot more danger than she realized and that she may have misread some of the circumstances.
Okay. Now, did you have any challenges writing this book?
Oh, so many challenges, because I would say that often I have characters that maybe they're keeping a secret about their past. And in the same way that when you meet someone, they don't tell you everything about themselves. It doesn't make them a liar, it doesn't make them a bad person. But people have secrets that they only reveal to you if they know you well. And so I would say in most of my books, you have main characters that have secrets. And as the reader spends more time to them, they start to open up and they start to reveal themselves. And instead, you have, in this book, in Every Lie I Told, you have Jackie playing a cat and mouse game with the reader. You cannot trust her. You cannot trust this character. She will very deliberately mislead you. And it's absolutely possible to sort of read between the lines sometimes. And once you sort of know her trigger points and the sort of the things that she lies about to sort of preserve herself, her reputation, you can kind of figure her out. So I feel like the reader actually will probably figure things out before Jackie is forced to tell them the truth by the end of the book. But it was really tricky because she's not always a likable character. And often I feel like, my characters, I can relate to what they're doing. And in this case, it's like, why would you do that? Why would you throw this person, under the bus and try to make them a suspect in the eyes of the police and, do these things? Like, how can you be so terrible to people? How can you not care at all about what you're doing and just leave this path of destruction? But that's pretty much like a scorched earth approach, is kind of how Jackie has lived her life. So it is consistent with her character. But yeah, it was definitely, I would say, a challenge both in terms of pacing the reveals, like sort of
Yeah.
balancing the lies with the reveals, and also just sometimes, I was fascinated by this character, but also very frustrated by this character.
Okay. Now, the novel deals with power, abuse, accountability. Like, what kind of conversations do you hope readers would spark after reading your book?
I would really hope, definitely, I would say that in terms of influences on the book, certainly like the whole Me Too reckoning and sort of post Me Too reckoning had a huge role in it, and how much, responsibility people have for their actions. There was a lot of conversation around power and older men taking advantage of younger women. There's nothing about underage victims. There's no one, there's no teenage victim in this book. Literally, everyone is an adult, and I didn't want to go into territory with actual, crimes against minors. It's actually something I don't write about. But I really wanted to explore power dynamics and that sort of idea of, who can you trust, who can you believe, um, whose story, should really be reckoned with, whose story has weight. How do you actually weigh these different variables? Because when the Me Too movement, you often had a situation where men were finally being held accountable for crimes that they committed. But we also saw sometimes accusers that turned out not to be trustworthy, that there were accusers that, they would,
Yep.
I mean, I don't want to name any names, but there
Yeah.
were certainly a couple that stand out in my mind as like, wow, you were trying to take advantage of this situation and, tarnish someone's reputation and harm them. So it's a kind of careful balance where women largely have not been believed. And so historically, my bias is to believe women and to believe, when someone has been victimized, to believe them. But I also did learn that you really have to sort of not just have a surface reading of things. It's really bad to just sort of take like an accusation and just run with it as if it's the truth. And, we always sort of need to dig deeper. I wish there were more of a process for that. It seems that there is either the sort of the court of like reputation and, cancellation and public accountability, and then legal courts. And there's really like nothing in between. So I don't know. I feel like there's not enough justice for victims, but I'd like to sort of keep that conversation going.
Definitely. Okay. Now, let's switching to the topic of new writers. Do you have any habits that help you grow from being a journalist to an award-winning novelist? Like, do you have any habits that you keep when you write?
So, one thing that I would say that I think really helped me, I discovered when I switched gears from journalism to fiction that I write at a different pace. So I can write with nonfiction. It's no big deal for me to sit down and just write 1,500 words or 2,000 words and sort of, have a finished piece pretty quickly. I do not have that process with fiction. I learned that it would take me about the same amount of time to write 200 or 300 words of fiction as like 1,000 of nonfiction, and that I need to revise and revise and revise. So part of what I learned was give myself permission to write really bad first drafts. That the key thing for me is getting the words down on the page. Um, with nonfiction, I seem to be able to sort of write a story in my head and put it down on the page and have it be sort of what I envisioned. Like, I wrote a story once about the brothels of Pompeii, and basically, like, I had the first line in my head, knew what I was going to talk about, sat down and wrote it, and it was done in a draft. Anytime I have an idea for fiction, what is in my head does not translate to the page the same way. And I've learned that it's not really um, a flaw, it's just sort of a different process. And so the key thing is to get the words down on the page and then to fix them. So not to be put off or afraid by the fact that I write more slowly. I write badly. Like in my first drafts, they're just terrible. I would never show anyone those drafts, but that it's okay for it to be like that. And that part of the process with writing fiction is that I get to do draft after draft to actually make it what I envision it. So, it's really like understanding your process, and everyone's different. Some people get it right in the first draft. That's amazing for them, but just, understand that process can be really messy.
Okay. Now, in particular to crime fiction, do you have any advice for writers that hope to break into this genre?
Yeah, I would say that crime writing is maybe one of the few genres that actually has a lot of group support. And by that, I mean there are fantastic groups like Sisters in Crime, which I have been a member of, but I joined before I even started publishing fiction. They have their Sisters in Crime chapters, but they also have a group they call the Guppies, which is for people who aren't published. And it gives you such a supportive environment, network. If you want people to read your work, there are people who'll do that. If you want help, maybe you're getting to the point where you're looking for an agent or you need information, maybe you're interested in self publishing. In Guppies, you will find so much information and so much support. And I love the group because it's about nurturing writers and giving that kind of support. Often, I think people feel shut out because until you have an agent, until you have a contract, you can't even join certain groups. And how do you find your community if you don't have that? So Sisters in Crime is a group that I always point crime writers towards. And it's, by the way, open to men and women. It's,
Hmm.
the name Sisters in Crime was just because when Sarah Paretsky founded the group, women were so underrepresented in crime writing.
Yes.
But it is, welcoming to everybody. And, it's a place to find a lot of support when you're kind of just, whether you're just starting out as a writer or whether you've been writing for a while, but you want to actually get your work published. It really helps.
Okay. Now, I'm sure you must query a lot over the years. So, like, how do you handle rejection, revisions, or any creative setbacks?
Oh my goodness. So this is something where, even when you're, published writer, I joke about this. So it took me forever to get my first short story published. I sent it around to all these different journals and everyone rejected it. And then finally, an online journal called Thuglet published it. And it was kind of amazing because the story got picked up for a Best of the Year anthology. And I thought, like, wow, this is great. Like, I've sort of made it. Like, my first short story got published, got into this Best of the Year anthology. Wow. Sent out my second story, got rejected by everybody. It still got rejected. I was like, but the first story, it did well. It got picked up for this anthology. Nope, no one cared. The only people that would publish my second story, Thuglet, once again. And that actually happened with my third story as well. Um, I realized that it is a very tough business to break into because there are so many people that are pitching the same venues. There aren't that many places that publish short stories. And so, you're up against a lot of competition, and sometimes there are writers they know already, they have relationships with already. There are only so many slots. So even if you have some success, it doesn't mean that they will, take your story. Sometimes there's just no room for it. So I try to keep a sense of humor about it. And I also try to be very open about how much rejection, still happens because even when you've had some success and you think, okay, this means I've been accepted in the business. No, I vent privately about this. I don't vent on social media about it because I just don't feel that it's really helpful to do that. But certainly my husband and my best friend and my mom, they have certainly, there have been many venting sessions to them and to my writers, my writer buddies. Like we all have a, in the group chat, it's all sort of about these things going on in the background. But understand it's not about you, that often it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with your story. And it certainly, I'm not encouraging people never to self-edit. Maybe you do need to go back and look at it, but it doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with your story. And I, can't emphasize enough, like keep writing. The best way I found to sort of channel my upset feelings was to sit down again and start writing and maybe like channel some of that anger, some of that rage that I would feel into the story. Yeah, so that's a good place for it.
So, Hillary, you're going to do a reading for us. Can you give us a bit of context before you start reading?
Sure. So I've already told you about the setup, for the book. And I'd say the one virtue in Jackie Swift is that she does care deeply about her sisters. So she does want to help her out. But I wanted to show you Jackie's sharkier side. So this is actually from the next day. She's already found the dead body. She's had to talk to the police. Her sister is missing still. But this is Jackie at work, operating as usual and keeping what's happened a secret, even though she used to work for the man, and they're basically, they're looking at how to use his death to an advantage at work. So I wanted to show you sort of Jackie's seedier side and what she's really like and how she operates. So reading now from Every Lie I Told. When I tried to leave the office at lunchtime, I was informed by the receptionist that Harlow, my boss, had already ordered lunch for everyone, and there was an all hands on deck meeting in the conference room. I gripped my phone tighter in my hand. Detective Ellis hadn't called back, and I lacked the nerve to risk another call from my office. There was no way to ask him what I needed to know about my sister's situation without setting off a rumor grenade. The meeting itself was predictable. Harlow, Rath and Associates had 14 employees, and there was arguably food for six. By the time I got there, I found a few stray arugula leaves in a bowl and some diet soda. I didn't care. When I was stressed, I couldn't eat, and I was plenty stressed at that point. Harlow stood at one end of the conference room, towering in her Louboutins, and preached. Her sermon was about Mortensen Adder and ladders of opportunity. She sounded like one of the villains on Game of Thrones, and I mostly tuned her out. Eric's death was now a news story, and I was monitoring it as it developed. The mentions were boilerplate, lacking flair and drama. No one hinted at murder. It was possible that the reporter had just been baiting me. One of the wire services ran a small item, and few New York-centric media sites picked it up. Public relations titan Eric Mortensen, 61, was found dead at his Manhattan home early Monday morning. The NYPD has not released any details, pending an investigation. Mortensen was widely regarded as the dark wizard of public relations, able to make damning news vanish or reappear at the whim of his wealthy, controversial, scandal-plagued clients. Early in his career, he worked with Edward L. Bernays, commonly regarded as the father of modern public relations. Bernays was the nephew of psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud and extensively promoted psychological manipulation of the public, a tactic Mortensen famously replicated with modern technology. Mortensen went on to found Mortensen Public Relations, which later became Mortensen Adder, one of the most successful publicity firms in the country. The firm dissolved in the wake of his acrimonious divorce from Vivian Adder. Acrimonious divorce. Now that was an understatement. We've got a dozen big projects on the go, but nothing's more important to me than what's going on with Eric Mortensen's business now that its owner has gone belly up, Harlow was saying. Jackie, what have you got for us so far? It was like that moment in a dream when you stand up and realize you've got no pants on. Eric was a font of sound bites and fond of quoting his hero, Edward L. Bernays. The Public Relations Council is the lineal descendant of the circus advance man. That was my role in that moment. Carnival barker, maker of mountains from molehills, shameless self-promoter. There was no percentage in revealing that Eric's expansive, much-envied business empire had crashed and burned in the last 18 months of his life due to extreme negligence. Better to dance to the tune Harlow was playing. I'm not going to lie, I announced to the room, because so many of us knew Eric. Some of you worked with him, and almost all of you went to his parties. We're all going to miss the hell out of him, but since we know he's having martinis with the devil by now. Harlow laughed at that, and everyone else followed suit. Well, everyone except Davina, who glowered in my direction. It would be criminal not to talk about what an immense opportunity his death means for us. I wasn't someone who sought out the spotlight. Doing what my sister did, putting her videos up for public consumption, would have killed me. But in smaller groups, I like to show off my smarts. I continued in that vein, speaking in meaningless generalities and quoting Eric and Bernays while everyone nodded along. I only skidded to a stop when Davina spoke up suddenly. You don't actually have anything, do you? Just a lot of cheap talk for Harlow's benefit. There was a collective intake of breath around the conference table. It was no secret that Davina hated me as much as I hated her. We were oil and water, fated never to mix well. Harlow's eyes were on me. There was no choice. I needed to cough up something good. Actually, I've already had a conversation with the man whose business kept Eric Mortensen in the black, I said. That wasn't true, but it didn't need to be. It only had to be convincing. The quarterly spend is invariably 6 figures. Harlow's eyes got brighter. That's a very big fish. I gazed around the table for dramatic effect. Kevin Durna's business is worth a great deal. There was a pin drop pause. Kevin Durna, the death magnet? Davina asked. There's no proof he ever murdered anyone, I said. All 4 times he's gone to court, he's been exonerated. Kevin Durna was an impossibly rich man who had gone to all the right schools and joined all the right clubs, but along the way he'd been expelled from those places for antisocial behavior. That was the polite term anyway. When he was 19, his parents perished in a house fire at their Connecticut mansion. Kevin wasn't charged in that case, but he was 6 months later when his sister died in a car crash. Prosecutors proved the brakes of her Porsche had been tampered with, but not that Kevin had done it, and he'd walked away from that episode as the sole heir to his parents' massive fortune. He'd used his family money to cosplay at different careers, club promoter, tech entrepreneur, restaurateur, without much success. Along the way, he'd married 3 times, but never divorced. Those women vanished, and after each unsuccessful prosecution, Kevin had been free to find a new bride. Somehow, he always did. Eric had worked with him for some 15 years before hiring me at Mortensen Adder. Early on, he'd taken me aside. Jackie, I'm not your father, but I want you to listen to me as if I were, he said. Kevin Durna is not the rabid dog people think he is, but the wires in his head are mangled when it comes to women. It's fine for you to talk to him on the phone and trade emails. Do not go anywhere alone with him. I remembered gasping. Did he really kill his parents and his sister and his first wife? This was before his second wife disappeared. I don't believe he would have killed his father, Eric had told me. The house fire must have been an accident. The rest, I don't know. Hell, I've gone hunting with the guy, and he's been fine, but he's different around women. Don't ever let him corner you. If he tries, call me immediately, okay? Day or night, it doesn't matter. Don't try to handle him yourself. That memory threw me off my game a little. My way of coping with Eric's death was to keep my heart hard against him, remembering how bad the last year of working for him had been and how horrifically it ended. But Eric was one of the few men in my life who'd never tried to hurt me, and I could feel my resolve fraying. Fortunately, Davina's snarky voice broke the spell. That's disgusting, Jackie. We don't need that kind of client. A psycho who's murdered most of his family. What are you on? Harlow gave her a cold stare. Death Magnet's money will spend the same as anyone else's. He's a demanding client, I said. He requires a lot of attention and a lot of hand-holding, but he always pays in full and on time. Davina, you can take point on this, Harlow said. Obviously, he should be Jackie's client, Davina shot back. Oh, he is. I'll be getting a percentage, but I can't work on the rest of Eric's client base if I have to focus on Kevin. As I said, he's demanding, as in all-consuming. I glanced in Davina's direction and smiled. Anyway, Davina's definitely his type. My nemesis flinched. She knew I wasn't lying. Get to work, Davina, Harlow snapped. Ah, Davina answered, subdued. Working with Kevin Durna had been challenging, but not particularly threatening, maybe because I'd always followed Eric's rule about not being alone with him. Now he'd be a problem for Davina, which meant there was justice somewhere in the universe. I have to head home after this meeting, I added. I've got some files there I need. I'll be working on connecting Eric's clients with other associates. As Harlow explained, this is a really great opportunity.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to visit us on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. This was such a pleasure.
The Artsy Raven is produced by Dark Helix Press. Introduction voiceover by Chris Gorman. Music by Tim Moore. Please access your bonus content on the Patreon website. Thank you very much for listening, and please stay safe.